group of countries which reached stabilization through devaluation prospered in contrast with those who reached stabilization through deflation. The prosperity was roughly equal to the degree of devaluation. Of the three Latin countries, Belgium, France, and Italy, Belgium devalued the most and was most prosperous. Her stabilization was at a price level below the world level, so that the belga was undervalued by about one-fifth. This served to encourage exports. For an industrial country such as Belgium, this made it possible for her to profit by the misfortunes of Britain. France was in a somewhat similar position. Italy, on the contrary, stabilized at a figure which made the lira considerably overvalued. This was done for purposes of prestige, Mussolini being determined to stabilize the lira at a value higher than that of the French franc. The effects of this overvaluation of the lira on the Italian economy were extremely adverse. Italy was never as prosperous after stabilization as she had been immediately before it. Not only did the countries which undervalued their money prosper, they decreased the disequilibrium between wealth and money. They were able to use the inflation to increase production. They escaped high taxes. They moderated or escaped the stabilization crisis and the deflationary depression. They improved their positions in the world market in respect to high-cost countries like Britain, and they replenished their gold stocks. A third group of countries reached stabilization through reconstruction. These were the countries in which the old monetary unit had been wiped out and had to be replaced by a new monetary unit. Among these were Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Russia. The first two of these were stabilized by a program of international assistance worked out through the League of Nations. The last, Russia, was forced to work out a financial system by herself. Germany had her system reorganized as a consequence of the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan, as we have seen in our discussion of reparations, provided the gold reserves necessary for a new currency and provided a control of foreign exchange which served to protect Germany from the accepted principles of orthodox finance. These controls were continued until 1930 and permitted Germany to borrow from foreign sources, especially the United States, the funds necessary to keep her economic system functioning with an unbalanced budget and an unfavorable balance of trade. In the period 1924 to 1929, by means of these funds, the industrial structure of Germany was largely rebuilt, so that when the Depression arrived, Germany had the most efficient industrial machine in Europe and probably the second most efficient in the world after the United States. The German financial system had inadequate controls over inflation and almost none over deflation because of the Dawes Plan restrictions on the open market operations of the Reichsbank and the generally slow response of the German economy to changes in the discount rate. Fortunately, such controls were hardly necessary. The price level was at 137 in 1924 and at the same figure in 1929, with 1913 serving as 100. In that 6-year period, it had reached as high as 142 in 1925 and fallen as low as 134 in 1926. This stability in prices was accompanied by stability in economic conditions. While these conditions were by no means booming, there was only one bad year before 1930. This was 1926, the year in which prices fell to 134 from the 1925 level of 142. In this year, unemployment averaged 2 million. The best year was 1925, in which unemployment averaged 636,000. This drop in prosperity from 1925 to 1926 was caused by a lack of credit as a result of the inadequate supplies of domestic credit and a temporary decline in supplies of foreign credit. It was this short slump in business which led Germany to follow the road to technological reorganization. This permitted Germany to increase output with decreasing employment. The average annual increase in labor productivity in the period 1924 to 1932 in Germany was about 5%. Output per labor hour in industry rose from 87.8 in 1925 to 115.6 in 1930 and 125 in 1932, where 1928 serves as 100. This increase in output served to intensify the impact of the Depression in Germany, so that unemployment, which averaged about 3 million in the year 1930, reached over 6 million in late 1932. The implications of this will be examined in detail in our study of the rise to power of Hitler. The stabilization period did not end until about 1931, although only minor powers were still stabilizing in the last year or so. The last great power to stabilize de jure was France in June 1928, and she had been stabilized de facto much earlier. In the whole period, about 50 countries stabilized their currencies on the gold standard, but because of the quantity of gold necessary to maintain the customary reserve ratios, that is, the pre-1914 ratios, at the higher prices, generally prevailing during the period of stabilization, no important country was able to go back on the gold standard as the term was understood in 1914. The chief change was the use of the gold exchange standard, or the quote, gold bullion standard, in place of the old gold standard. Under the gold exchange standard, foreign exchange of gold standard countries could be used as reserves against notes or deposits in place of reserves of gold. In this way, the world's limited supplies of gold could be used to support a much greater volume of fictitious wealth in the world as a whole, since the same quantity of gold could act as bullion reserve for one country and as gold exchange reserve for another. Even those countries which stabilized on a direct gold standard did so in a quite different way from the situation in 1914. In few countries was there free and gratuitous convertibility between notes, coin, and bullion. In Great Britain, for example, by the Gold Standard Act of May 1925, notes could be exchanged for gold only in the form of bullion and only in amounts of at least 400 fine ounces, that is, not less than $8,268 worth at a time. Bullion could be presented to the mint for coinage only by the Bank of England, although the bank was bound to buy all gold offered at 77 shillings 10 and a half pence per standard ounce. Notes could be converted into coin only at the option of the bank. Thus, the gold standard of 1925 was quite different from that of 1914. This would indicate that even in its most superficial aspects, the international gold standard of 1914 was not re-established by 1930. The legal provisions were different. The financial necessities and practices were quite different. The profound underlying economic and commercial conditions were entirely different, and becoming more so. Yet financiers, businessmen, and politicians tried to pretend to themselves and to the public that they had restored the financial system of 1914. They had created a facade of cardboard and tinsel which had a vague resemblance to the old system, and they hoped that if they pretended vigorously enough, they could change this facade into the lost reality for which they yearned. At the same time, while pursuing policies such as tariffs, price controls, production controls, and so on, which drove this underlying reality even farther from that which had existed in 1914, they besought other governments to do differently. Such a situation, which pretends treated as if it were reality, and reality treated as if it were a bad dream, could lead only to disaster. This is what happened. The period of stabilization merged rapidly into a period of deflation and depression. As we have said, the stage of financial capitalism did not place emphasis on the exchange of goods or the production of goods as the earlier stages of commercial capitalism and industrial capitalism had done. In fact, financial capitalism had little interest in goods at all, but was concerned entirely with claims on wealth, stocks, bonds, mortgages, insurance, deposits, proxies, interest rates, and such. It invested capital not because it desired to increase the output of goods or services, but because it desired to float issues, frequently excess issues, of securities on this productive basis. It built railroads in order to sell securities, not in order to transport goods. It constructed great steel corporations to sell securities, not in order to make steel, and so on. But incidentally, it greatly increased the transport of goods, the output of steel, and the production of other goods. By the middle of the stage of financial capitalism, however, the organization of financial capitalism had evolved to a highly sophisticated level of security, promotion, and speculation which did not require any productive investment as a basis. Corporations were built upon corporations in the form of holding companies, so that securities were issued in huge quantities, uh, bringing profitable fees and commissions to financial capitalists without any increase in economic production whatever. Indeed, these financial capitalists discovered that they could not only make killings out of the issuing of such securities, they could also make killings out of the bankruptcy of such corporations through the fees and commissions of reorganization. A very pleasant cycle of flotation, bankruptcy began to be practiced by these financial capitalists. The more excessive the flotation, the greater the profits, and the more imminent the bankruptcy. The more frequent the bankruptcy, the greater the profits of reorganization, and the sooner the opportunity of another excessive flotation with its accompanying profits. This excessive stage reached its highest peak only in the United States. In Europe, it was achieved only in isolated cases. The growth of financial capitalism made possible a centralization of world economic control and a use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and the indirect injury of all other economic groups. This concentration of power, however, could be achieved only by using methods which planted the seeds which grew into monopoly capitalism. Financial control could be exercised only imperfectly through credit control and interlocking directorates. In order to strengthen such control, some measure of stock ownership was necessary. But stock ownership was dangerous to banks because their funds consisted more of deposits, that is, short-term obligations, than of capital or long-term obligations. This meant that banks which sought economic control through stock ownership were putting short-term obligations into long-term holdings. This was safe only so long as the latter could be liquidated rapidly at a price high enough to pay for short-term obligations as they presented themselves. But these holdings of securities were bound to become frozen because both the economic and the financial systems were deflationary. The economic system was deflationary because power production and modern technology gave a great increase in the supply of real wealth. This meant that in the long run, the control by banks was doomed by the progress of technology. The financial system was also deflationary because of the bankers' insistence on the gold standard, with all that this implies. To escape from this dilemma, the financial capitalists acted upon two fronts. On the business side, they sought to sever control from ownership of securities, believing they could hold the former and relinquish the latter. On the industrial side, they sought to advance monopoly and restrict production, thus keeping prices up and their security holdings liquid. The efforts of financiers to separate ownership from control were aided by the great capital demands of modern industry. Such demands for capital made necessary the corporation form of business organization. This inevitably brings together the capital owned by a large number of persons to create an enterprise controlled by a small number of persons. The financiers did all they could to make the former number as large as possible and the latter number as small as possible. The former was achieved by stock splitting, issuing securities of low par value, and by high-pressure security salesmanship. The latter was achieved by plural voting stock, non-voting stock, pyramiding of holding companies, election of directors by co-optation, and similar techniques. The result of this was that larger and larger aggregates of wealth fell into the control of smaller and smaller groups of men.